All right, lovely lovelies. So we are going to proceed with our conversation, our last conversation here about um, plants. And while you guys think about the warm up, I wanted to give you a heads up that the next few lessons, or the lessons as we move forward, are going to be formatted a little bit differently, mostly because this process that I have been using, and I really like using Edpuzzle because I feel like it is a very natural way for us to learn. It seems very much like the classroom. It's pretty data heavy as far as making these videos and then uploading them to YouTube and then moving them from YouTube to Edpuzzle. It's just ending up being a lot more time consuming because of that data bit. And so I'm going to do stuff a little bit differently, and hopefully it still makes sense and is useful. So your warm-up is to describe the male and female reproductive structures of flowers. So we will start with the male reproductive structures because they are simpler, as is sometimes the case. Male reproductive structure of the plant it's called the stamen, and I think it's easier to remember because it's got that M-E-N there at the end, and it's in the central part of the flower, kind of around that very center, are the components of the stamen, and so it's made up of a structure that has this piece coming down. So this part here is called the anther, and that is where pollen is produced. And this part here is called the filament, and that's, and the filament is essentially, it holds up the anther. That's its job, is to hold up the anther. Okay. All right, and then the female reproductive structure is in the very center of the flower, in what's called a perfect flower or a typical flower. And it is shaped kind of like this. You can see my beautiful artistry here. And so this part here at the top, well, so just to make it similar to our other one, so this is the female reproductive part. The whole thing together, all of it together, is called a pistil, or sometimes it'll be called a carpel. So I wish they had the same name all the time, but it's just not always that way. So this part here at the very top is called the stigma. This middle part is called the style. Put it down here. And then this very bottom part here, excuse me, is called the ovary. And so those are the male and female reproductive structures of our flower. And so today we're going to talk about plant behavior and how that can be regulated, kind of what that's all about. So, you know, another way you could say this is communication of the plant, and it's going to be within the plant and a little bit between plants. But mostly it's going to be communication between different components of the plant itself, the different organs, really. Okay, so plant behavior. We know, I hope we remember, that plants are what's called sessile. They're fixed in one place. So they don't move, can't pick themselves up and move to another place. But they do respond to their environment. And so the way they respond is through movement and growth. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so there are really two categories of movement in plants. And one group are called tropic or tropic movement or tropism. And so that's what you see here. And nastic movement or, nastic movement. And so essentially the difference has to do with the direction of the stimuli, or, you know, what's causing the response, and how the response is in reference to that stimuli. So if the response is in the movement is in response to the direction of the stimuli. So meaning if it moves toward the stimulus, that would be a positive tropism. If it moves away from the stimulus, that can be a negative tropism. Nastic movement is movement that is not associated with the direction of the stimuli. That doesn't mean it's not associated with a stimuli or with a stimulus. It is associated with a stimulus. It's just not associated with the direction of the stimulus. So hopefully that'll become clearer as we go through these. All right, so really nastic movement, we're not going to talk as much about just because it isn't quite as simple as tropic movement. And tropic movement is simpler and so therefore easier for us to understand as we're just beginning to learn about plant behavior. So nastic movement is what is seen in these behaviors here. So a classic example of plant behavior are what are called capture leaves, which is what you see here with this Venus flytrap. This is a carnivorous plant. And so it's capturing insects in order, remember, that it is not trying to get necessarily the glucose, but carnivorous plants live in nutrient-poor soil. So they need nitrogen and phosphorus. And so that's really what they're obtaining from the things that they capture. And so these parts of the Venus flytrap, these kind of what looks like a mouth, are called capture leaves because they're modified leaves that are used to capture something. And there are triggers on these leaves. You may have seen videos. A lot of times this is something that students are pretty familiar with. So there's a certain amount of times that the certain amount of triggers that the insect has to contact within a certain amount of time, and the capture leaves will collapse. Now, hopefully you can see that this really isn't about the direction of the stimulus. It's not about what direction the fly is moving or even what direction it's pushing those trigger structures that are inside of the capture leaves. It's just triggering a movement, and that movement is to close. And this is really has to do with osmotic pressure, meaning the water pressure of the cells that are at the base of these capture leaves, and the movement of that water out of or into those cells, causing the capture leaves to move. And so that's what's happening there. Another example of nastic movement is flowering. So flowering follows the same process pretty much all the time. It's going to open up from a bud to a flower. And that movement is not associated with it's a chemical signal. We're going to talk about chemical signals later. It's a chemical signal from within the plant that's telling it to open, but there's not anything associated with the directionality of that stimulus and this behavior. And then another example of this is what's called stem waving or twirling. Now, when the stem comes in contact with something, then there can be tropic movement, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But when it's just twirling, and you can look at videos of this, there's lots of actually really cool videos of this, where the plant is actually, it looks like it's dancing or moving in this twirling way. And during that time, its movement is not based on the directionality of any stimuli. It just has that movement. And so that's another example of nastic movement. All right, so all the other types of movements that we're going to talk about are tropisms, and you may remember hearing about these in the past. If you haven't, that's okay. They are certainly understandable. But these are ways that, remember, we're talking about in terms of plant behavior. We're talking about responding to the environment through movement or growth. And so what we're going to see here is this really, it's what's cool about it and is it's very evident what the stimulus is and what the behavior is. And so it's just neat to see and important to understand as well. So the first one that type of tropism we're going to talk about is called phototropism. And so this is when plants grow or move toward a light source. And so there's lots of cool experiments you can see where people have built boxes and only let light come through one way, and they put plants in the bottom, and they like build this little maze thing, and the plant will find its way. So it's a really neat thing, and that type of this type of tropism is a positive tropism. So the stimulus of the light is what we're moving toward, and so that is a positive tropism. And another thing that's kind of similar to phototropism is heliotropism, which is what we see in some flowering plants, especially sunflowers, is that the face of the flower seems to track the movement of the sun across the sky. Again, you can look at videos of this too. And so it's a similar sort of idea as phototropism, but it's more movement instead of growth. And it's worth pointing out that this prefix photo, remember, is also in the word photosynthesis because it means light. It doesn't mean picture. It means light. And so photosynthesis to make with light, phototropism to move with light. So that's our first tropism. And we're going to talk later about what is actually allowing this to happen after we talk about the different tropisms. All right. So this one is one that I just am super interested in. It's called thigmotropism. And this is involved with touch stimuli. So remember earlier when I said that we had that nastic movement where you have the vine or the stem twirling, when it touches a surface like this here and starts to move around it, that is responding to touch. And so that's called a positive thigmotropism. So it's responding positively to that touch. Now, I have seen lots of examples that people claim are negative tropisms, negative thigmotropisms. So, for example, if you look here, this tree, the idea is that the wind is blowing this way across the top of this mountain structure, I guess, and that pressure or that stimulus of the wind is leading to this growth of the tree. And I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. But then whenever I started to read about it a little bit more, it seems that it's really not, that's not what's happening. The tree isn't growing in response to the wind in the sense that it's not getting a signal from the plant itself to grow in that way. It's that because it's being held, and it could be held by lots of things, it's just forced to grow that way. And that's not what we see with the ivy, right? The ivy is not being forced by this tendril here, or by this piece of fence here. So it's not, I'm not sure that this really qualifies as thigmotropism. So I don't want to tell you that it does. And another one that I've heard is that what's called root avoidance. And so as the plant is growing in, let's say if it was just in soil, instead of like this here, if it was growing in soil, and as the roots of the plant were starting to grow, if there was like a rock or something here, that the roots would come into contact with that and move away. And so that would be a negative thigmotropism. But that just doesn't jive with everything I've always learned about erosion and how, and I've seen so many pictures, even this one here, of roots in rock structures. So it doesn't make sense to me either. The only thing actually that kind of made sense to me is, I actually have a picture of it here. This is my dog at the dog park. But you can see that these two trees are kind of, they obviously both wanted to grow there. And so this tree is growing this way, away from, or it seems like to me that this one's growing away and this one's kind of able to maintain standing up more straight. So I don't know if that is because of a physical contact here, and then that's causing that to move in that direction, because it's not growing right up against it. So anyhow, more research to be done. Maybe you guys can figure it out and tell me. I just don't want to give you the impression that that's the case, that there is this wind thing whenever it doesn't actually seem to be supported by anything. Okay, so thigmotropism is touch. And a lot of times people mistake the Gnostic movement in Venus flytraps as thigmotropism. And almost, you'll see it on websites all the time. But this is not thigmotropism because a tropism has to do with the directionality of the stimulus. So it's not actually that big of a distinction. I just figure you're smart enough to understand the difference. It's not that complicated. All right. Now, another type of tropism that you may have seen in the past is what's called gravitropism, or you'll see it called geotropism, and it has to do with the gravitational pull of the planet. And so the plant grows or moves in response to that gravitational stimuli. And so you can see in this tree here, I took this picture when we went to Grand Canyon a few years ago, that this was originally, obviously there's been some erosion on the side of this mountain. And so this is where the trunk was coming out of the ground. And there was some injury or something that caused this to be tipped this way. Maybe there was something on top of it. But the stem is still holding itself as much upright as possible. You see the same thing over here. And that's because these cells are responding to the gravitational pull of the planet. But there are receptor cells within the structure of the plant that allow it to detect that. Here of the gravitropism of the stem is negative gravitropism because it's not in the direction of the stimulus. Gravitational pull is toward the planet, toward the center of the earth. And so it's moving opposite of that, upward, and so that's negative. And then what we see with roots is a positive gravitropism. So they're moving in the direction of gravity. And I really like this picture here because it shows when you plant a seed, you don't sit there and look at it and go, okay, where's the root going to come out? I need to make sure I put that part down so that it knows, so that it grows the right way. I don't want the root coming out of the top, coming out of the soil. You don't have to think about it. You just drop the seed in there. And that's what you can see here with these corn seeds, is that no matter which direction the corn seed was placed, the root starts to grow in the direction of gravity. So that's gravitropism. And so here, these are seedlings that were germinated in space. And so they're in, I shouldn't say just in space, in a weightless environment on a spaceship. And so they don't show that behavior. They're all germinating exactly the same way because of the fact that they're not getting that stimulus. So it's really cool how they research that. All right. Now there are let me just say, lots of other tropisms than these, but there's these other two I wanted to bring up to you, which are hydro and chemotropism. So hydrotropism is plants' roots moving toward water, and so that's a positive tropism. And that is actually a specific type of chemotropism. So chemo just means chemical, and so water, H2O, is a chemical, and so that's what's happening there. And then, but that's not the only type of chemotropism. And so a very characteristic example is from what we talked about in reproduction, which is the pollen tube that grows from the stigma down into the ovary. And so as you can see here, it has to come not just down, straight down sometimes, but it has to go kind of around to get this access to where it needs to. And that is because there is a chemical signal coming from the eggs, from the ovary. And so what's happening is this pollen tube is growing in response to that chemical signal. And so there's lots of other examples of this in plants. But that's the one kind of that we've talked about already. So that's what's called chemotropism. And so on the note of those chemicals, we're going to talk about what leads to these plant behaviors that we've been discussing, at least leads to some of them. And those are hormones. So Hormones exist not just in plants, but in all kinds of living things, and essentially they're an internal chemical signal. So what is the key is not just that they're an internal signal, but that they are produced in one part of the organism and affect other parts. So this is true in mammals, in fish, in plants, in fungi. That's what makes something a hormone. So they help to regulate and coordinate behaviors. Not all behaviors, but a lot. And so we're going to talk about some of these. As you can see in this picture, there are a big old bunch. We're only going to talk about these 4. Okay, so try not to panic. So the one that we spend the most time talking about, and the one that I would say is the most important for you to really think through, is what's called auxin. And there are lots of things that happen within the plant, as you can see here, that are regulated by auxin. Now, the key here, and I hope this makes sense, is auxin regulates plant cell growth, meaning the individual cell's size. A single cell within a multicellular organism can grow. It can get bigger and it can get smaller. The whole organism, if it's multicellular, can get bigger and smaller based on cell division. But the individual cell can also grow. Auxin is not about cell division. It's about cell growth. And so what it's going to do is stimulate growth in some parts and inhibit growth in other parts. And so let's think about how this relates back to our behaviors that we were talking about earlier. So phototropism, okay? This auxin just explains how phototropism works. So we're going to look at both of these pictures here because I tried to find one that showed everything that I wanted and I could not find it. So we're going to look at both of these and hope that that allows us to kind of see what I'm talking about. So if you look at the top one, you'll see that it shows these auxin molecules, and they're distributed all throughout. So they're produced in the roots, and they're spread out through the whole plant. And once they arrive, you can see they're kind of equally distributed in this part. This is a growing stem, okay, a shoot. You can kind of see it here of a plant, and so it's growing upward. And so here's the sun. Here it is directly above this shoot, and so the auxin is equally distributed. Now, if the plant is only getting sunlight on one side of that stem, what happens is those auxin molecules move, and they move over to the shady or darker part of the stem. And since those auxin molecules stimulate cell elongation, the cells on this side that's over here in the shade are going to grow. They're going to get longer. They're going to get bigger. And the ones on the other side, or even if they stay the same size, are going to be pushed downward, and this is going to cause this turn. For those of you that are in band, think about when you have to turn in marching band. When you have to turn, if you're on the outside of that turn, you have to move much further than if you're on the inside. And so that's what's happening here, is that we have these cells getting longer. So I like this picture because it shows the molecules, but I like this picture because I think it's easy to see what part is shaded, what part's in the shade. So this side over here has light, and then this side over here is in the shade. And so the auxins would move over here, and you can see that these have gotten shorter, and then, these have gotten longer, and then these here have gotten shorter. And so that leads to that curve. So that's an example of a tropism, and it's regulated by a hormone. All right, so another plant behavior, plant behavior that's regulated by a hormone is cell division, and actually lengthening of the stem. And this is controlled by a group of plant hormones called gibberellins. And I know it's kind of a silly sounding word, but that's what they're called. And so gibberellins are associated with a lot of things that that plants do, a lot of their behavior. And they work actually alongside with auxins sometimes, but essentially what they do is they're involved in things that involve cell division. So increasing size or rapid stem lengthening. So if you look at something like this agave plant, it's got this shoot that grows upward when it's ready to flower. And so we've got the flower formation and this stalk that grows, and that is associated with gibberellins. Also seed germination. And I included these two. So these are actually cases where humans are using gibberellin hormones to get a certain appearance of these, the plant or the fruit. So in both cases on the left, these are not treated with any gibberellin hormone exogenously, meaning that these on the right, they actually sprayed or poured into the ground. I'm not sure exactly how it was administered, but they're exposed to gibberellins. And so you can see we've got the effect of this hormone on these plants. So that's the next category. Okay, so that's two so far, auxins and gibberellins. All right, the next type are called cytokinins. Now these are also about cell division, and honestly I think this one's easier to remember because I can remember that the last stage of cell division is cytokinesis, and so these are associated with that that part of plant growth. But the other thing that cytokinins are really associated with is what's called delaying senescence. And senescence is just a science word for aging. And so there are certain behaviors of an aging plant. They shed their leaves, like their leaves fall off, their flowers fall off, their fruits fall off. And so what cytokinins do is they delay that. And so, for example, in this picture, these two leaves were taken off of a plant, and the ones on the left was left untreated, and the one on the right was exposed to cytokinins. And you can see the one on the right looks shiny, it's bright green, it looks like it could still be on the tree. And the other one, what's happening is that it's starting to, because it doesn't have that hormone to prevent it, it's starting to degrade. The chlorophyll is starting to degrade in the leaf. And so that is also something we see in fruits. So whenever the plant is holding on to its fruits, that is due to cytokinins. So that's another group. That was our third one. All right, and then this is our fourth and final one. So just these four. And this one's called ethylene. And ethylene exists not just as a hormone in plants. There's a lot of applications in chemistry for ethylene. But what ethylene does is it works internally to stimulate the shedding of leaves. So it's going to be working opposite of the cytokinins and the ripening of fruits. So that's what's going to cause these fruits to begin to ripen. Now, one of the things that I just think is interesting about ethylene, just because I didn't understand this part of it, but I did know that like if I had tomatoes or avocados that were not ripe yet, my great-grandma would say is to put them in a paper bag with a ripe banana or a brown banana. And I was just like, this lady is crazy. But then I learned that there's actually science for that. So what's happens, especially bananas, produce a lot of ethylene. And in this case, the ethylene is acting as a pheromone instead of a hormone. The difference being a pheromone is a chemical signal that affects it affects another organism. And so it's sending a signal out from the organism instead of internally. And so what's happening is that ethylene, which is a chemical stimulant to ripen, is going from this banana to whatever else it is, and it causes it to ripen faster, which is just kind of crazy. And that's also why, like, if you have bananas that are starting to, because bananas are just an example, they just produce a lot of ethylene. Like, once they start to go bad, if you have them near your other fruits and vegetables will start to ripen, over-ripen as well. So you got to get them out of there. So it's just an example. I think kind of cool. All right. So those are our 4 hormones that you're responsible for. Okay. So let's go back so you can see them again. Auxin, gibberellins, cytokinins, and ethylene. All right. Now, I'm not going to get very far into this, but I think it's important for you guys to understand that not all of the behaviors that we see in plants are due to hormones. Just like not all the behaviors that we see in humans are due to hormones, right? Only just teenagers. And so I mentioned this before, that there are plants that have different seasons that they flower. And so this is a process called photoperiodism. And you'll see this listed as a tropism, but it's not. This is what is called a protein signal transduction. And I'm not this is as simple as I can make it. But essentially, it's to allow flowering plants. So you might notice, okay, that in flowering plants, that even though those plants did not start growing at the same time, you could have planted them on completely different months, but certainly completely different days from seed. They didn't start growing at the same time, but they'll flower at the same time. Okay. This is because it's an advantage for the plant for that to happen, because it promotes cross-pollination between the plants. And so what's happening here is the plants are detecting there are photoreceptors in the plant cells. They're detecting the change in the length of daylight and dark as the seasons progress. Okay, so just like in the wintertime here where we live, the days are shorter, meaning we have less hours of daylight. And in the springtime, we see that increasing, so more hours of daylight until the summer. And so these plant cells detect that difference, and basically what happens with a long day plant is whenever there's this kind of magic time period, and once we have that many hours of day, then the long day plant will bloom. But the short day plant won't. If it's that long period of day, the short day plant will not, but the long day plant will. And then the opposite will happen with whenever there is a longer night and a shorter day, is that our short day plant will bloom and our long day plant will not. And so depending on how many hours of light and dark will determine how this works. And I put this little picture down here. I'm not even going to mess with it. Okay? If you're interested in it, look it up. It's relatively interesting, but there's a lot to it. But this is what regulates this flowering. Okay? That's it. That's the end of plants. I'm sorry it's taken us so long to get through it. Things did not go quite as I had hoped, but we're going to do stuff a little bit differently, and I hope it goes smoother for all of us. I hope you are all well. I miss you tons, and take care.